Keanu Reeves walked into the bar quietly, his footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, but aside from that, the evening felt calm. The dim lights of the bar gave off a soft glow, casting shadows across the walls. It was the kind of place where people went to unwind after a long day, quiet, with the gentle hum of a jukebox playing in the background. The air smelled faintly of stale beer and old wood, adding to the atmosphere of the secluded, no-frills setting. Keanu had just wrapped up a busy day of filming and, like many actors who led a public life, he enjoyed escaping the chaos from time to time. He wanted to blend into the background tonight, not looking for attention. He wasn't dressed in anything flashy, just a simple shirt and jeans, looking like any other man who might walk into a bar after work. He sat down at the counter, ordering a drink without much fuss. A glass of whiskey, neat. Just enough to relax without drowning in alcohol. The bartender, an older man with a graying beard, nodded as he set the glass in front of Keanu. He didn't ask questions or make small talk. Keanu appreciated that. Sometimes, the simplicity of silence could be a relief, especially in a world filled with constant chatter. As Keanu took a sip, he let the warmth of the whiskey spread through him. The place was mostly empty. Just a few people at the tables in the corners, minding their own business. It seemed like the perfect spot for someone looking for solitude. The low murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses were soothing. Keanu leaned back on his bar stool, taking in the peace and quiet. But that peace didn't last long. A loud bang echoed through the bar as the door swung open, and a group of rowdy bikers stumbled in. Their laughter filled the room before they even entered, their voices rough, full of brash energy. The air in the bar seemed to shift at their arrival. The bikers wore leather jackets covered in patches and studs, tattoos covering their arms, some even visible on their necks. They carried an aura of trouble with them, and their loud, boisterous manner seemed to demand that everyone notice them. They were a lot to take in at once, and Keanu could feel the change in the atmosphere. The bartender glanced over at them with a look that suggested he had seen this sort of thing before. His face tensed, but he said nothing. The bikers were clearly regulars in town, known for causing trouble wherever they went. The group's leader was easy to pick out. He was the largest of them all, with a thick beard and a scar over his left eyebrow. He walked into the bar with a confident swagger, clearly enjoying the attention that came with his presence. The other bikers followed him like loyal dogs, laughing loudly and making crude jokes as they found their way to the far corner of the bar. But their eyes soon landed on Keanu, who was still sitting quietly, sipping his drink. The leader's gaze lingered on him for a moment, sizing him up, as if deciding whether this man, sitting alone, would be an easy target. "Hey," the leader shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "What's the actor doing in a place like this? Ain't you a little out of your league?" The other bikers snickered, finding amusement in his words. Keanu didn't flinch, though. He didn't even look up, merely taking another sip of his drink, his expression as calm as ever. He wasn't here for trouble, but he wasn't going to give in to petty taunts either. The leader didn't like that. He walked over, towering above Keanu's seat. The others followed, their footsteps heavy, their faces showing no kindness. "What's the matter? Too good for us, huh?" the leader asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Keanu looked up slowly, meeting the leader's gaze. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to simply acknowledge the man's presence. He didn't want to engage in an argument, but something in the way the leader was posturing seemed like it could escalate quickly. Still, Keanu's calm demeanor remained unchanged. "Not looking for any trouble," Keanu said softly, his voice steady. There was no anger in his words, just a simple request for peace. "Just here to have a drink and relax." But the leader wasn't satisfied. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from Keanu's. "Yeah? Well, I think you've had enough relaxation for one night. You see, we don't usually like actors in places like this. You think you're too special for a place like this? He sneered. Keanu remained silent, not rising to the bait. He wasn't about to be drawn into a confrontation, especially over something as trivial as an insult. But the group of bikers was far from done. They began making snide comments and jokes, clearly trying to provoke him. Some of the bikers even nudged each other, laughing as they watched their leader make a spectacle of himself. Keanu's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere around him shifted. It was clear the leader wanted a reaction, but Keanu wasn't willing to give him the satisfaction. He could feel the tension rising in the air. The other patrons in the bar were starting to notice the commotion. Whispers filled the space, and a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Despite the taunts, Keanu didn't budge. He stayed seated, his posture relaxed, as if the scene wasn't even happening. But he knew that trouble was brewing. The situation was about to go from verbal to physical. The bikers weren't going to let it go, not when they saw that Keanu wasn't going to engage with them. As the leader took a step closer, Keanu could sense the tension in the air. His mind was calm, calculating. He wasn't here to make a scene, but if it came down to it, he could handle himself. The bikers, on the other hand, didn't know what they were in for. The leader took another step, his face darkening with irritation. The words he was about to say were likely going to push things even further, but Keanu didn't respond, instead continuing to sip his drink as if nothing was happening. It was as if he was waiting for the moment when the entire room would go silent, the calm before the storm. And just as Keanu expected, the storm was coming. Keanu remained seated, his hands steady as he wrapped his fingers around a glass of whiskey. He took another sip, the liquid smooth as it slid down his throat, but his attention never left the leader of the bikers. The atmosphere in the bar had shifted from casual to tense. The other patrons had quieted down, stealing glances at the confrontation taking place. It was clear that something was about to happen, but Keanu wasn't the type to rush into things. He was a patient man. The leader of the bikers took another step closer, his breath smelling faintly of alcohol and tobacco. He had made his way around the bar to stand directly in front of Keanu, blocking his view of the rest of the room. "I don't like being ignored, actor," the leader said, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just sit here and act like you're too good for us? Like we don't deserve your attention?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even move an inch. His gaze remained steady, focused on the leader. He could feel the eyes of the other bikers on him, watching eagerly for a reaction, waiting for the moment when this could all spiral into something bigger. The leader was looking for a fight, but Keanu wasn't the kind to give it to him that easily. "I'm not here for a fight," Keanu said, his voice calm, almost too calm. It wasn't a challenge, it was simply a statement. His words hung in the air between them, but they didn't seem to soften the leader's mood. The leader's face twisted in frustration. He took a step forward, so close that Keanu could feel the heat from his body. "You think you're special, huh? Just because you've been in a few movies, you think we're supposed to bow down to you? You think just because you're an actor, you can walk into a place like this and make everyone respect you?" Keanu didn't say anything this time. He simply looked at the man, his eyes focused and unblinking. He knew exactly where this was headed, and it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. The leader, clearly eager to provoke him, stepped even closer, his shadow falling over Keanu. He was now so close that Keanu could feel his breath on his face. "Don't just sit there like a coward," the leader sneered, almost spitting the words. "Get up. Show me what you've got, tough guy." Keanu, still calm, set the glass down gently on the bar and slowly stood up. The action was deliberate, controlled. He didn't need to make a grand gesture, and there was no need to make a scene. But the bikers surrounding him seemed to think otherwise. One of them, a younger man with tattoos running down his arms, stepped forward, his fists clenched. He seemed to be the most eager to get the fight started. "You heard the boss," the younger biker said, his voice carrying a challenge. "Get up and fight like a man." The room was silent now, everyone watching as Keanu slowly turned to face the younger biker. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but ready, like someone who had been in situations like this before. It was clear to everyone watching that Keanu wasn't intimidated. But the bikers still didn't know who they were dealing with. They saw a man who didn't fight back, someone who wasn't willing to stand up for himself. What they didn't see was the years of discipline and training he had hidden beneath his calm exterior. The leader let out a low laugh, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and anger. "You're not as tough as you look, are you?" he said. "Just another pretty face in Hollywood, thinking you can come in here and act like a hero. Let's see if you can back it up." Keanu didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes scanning the room for a split second. He wasn't just looking at the bikers, he was sizing up the situation. The door to the bar was still open, but it was clear there was no easy way out of this. The bikers had already surrounded him, and it was unlikely they would let him leave without some kind of confrontation. The younger biker, growing impatient, lunged forward, throwing a punch aimed directly at Keanu's face. The moment was so fast, so sudden, that most people didn't even have time to react. But Keanu was ready. In a blur of motion, he sidestepped, avoiding the punch entirely. The biker, caught off guard, lost his balance and stumbled forward, unable to recover in time. Before the biker could even think about regaining his stance, Keanu's hand shot out, grabbing the biker's wrist and twisting it with such precision that the man yelped in pain. In the blink of an eye, the younger biker was disarmed, his hand forced behind his back in a hold that looked like it could break the arm if Keanu chose to apply more pressure. The room fell into stunned silence. The bikers stared in disbelief as their friends struggled in Keanu's grip, unable to break free. The leader, who had been standing with a confident smirk on his face, now looked uncertain. His eyes narrowed, realizing that the man he had been taunting wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "Let him go," the leader demanded, his voice shaking slightly. He was no longer as confident as he had been moments before. Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another look at the other bikers, who seemed to be weighing their options. They could either continue pushing forward and risk making the situation even worse, or they could back down. Keanu's eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't afraid of a fight, but he didn't want to make the first move. He wasn't here to start anything, only to end it. The choice was theirs. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, Keanu released the younger biker's wrist, gently guiding him away before stepping back and returning to his spot at the bar. The younger biker stumbled, rubbing his wrist, clearly embarrassed and frustrated. The leader didn't say anything more, but the tension in the room had shifted. The bikers, realizing they had underestimated Keanu, began to retreat, though not without casting angry glances over their shoulders. Keanu remained calm, sitting back down at the bar and picking up his glass. He didn't need to say anything. The message had been clear, and the bikers had gotten the point. The room slowly returned to normal, but the atmosphere had changed. The other patrons, who had been watching in fear and anticipation, now relaxed slightly, though they couldn't help but glance at Keanu with a newfound respect. Keanu, however, didn't notice. He simply finished his drink and quietly motioned for the bartender to bring him another. The night had almost returned to normal, but the memory of what had just happened would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The bikers, now visibly frustrated, took a step back. The room was still. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the sound of the jukebox playing a slow, Steady tune in the corner. Keanu sat at the bar, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his glass, his eyes still calm, his demeanor unwavering. It was clear to everyone watching that he was a man who had seen much more than this. The bikers, on the other hand, seemed unsure of what to do next. Their leader, the big man who had started all of this, stood silently for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides. He had expected an easy fight, something that would give him a boost of confidence in front of his friends, but now the situation had taken an unexpected turn. Keanu's cool and controlled reaction had thrown him off. He wasn't used to being ignored, and the way Keanu had effortlessly disarmed his friend had left him feeling small. The leader wasn't about to let this go, not in front of his crew. He couldn't let his pride be wounded like this. "You think you're some kind of hero," the leader growled, his voice now tinged with anger. "You think you can just walk in here and embarrass us like that?" Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The leader's fists were still clenched, his body tense. Keanu could feel the rising tension in the room, the shift in the air. But he wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to prove anything. The real fight, if it came, would be swift and calculated. The bikers, though, seemed to be growing more desperate. The younger biker, the one who had tried to take a swing earlier, looked at the leader, then back at Keanu. His face was a mix of confusion and fear. He had never seen his crew be handled like this before. This wasn't some simple bar brawl. This was something different. Something bigger. "Boss, maybe we should just leave it," the younger biker said, his voice nervous. He took a step back, almost instinctively. "This guy ain't like the others." The leader shot him a glare. "Shut up," he snapped. "We're not backing down now. Not after this." The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them were looking at the door, probably thinking about making a quick exit. But they didn't move. They were still under the leader's command, and he wasn't going to back down. He had to save face. He had to show his crew that he wasn't afraid of some Hollywood actor. Keanu, still sitting at the bar, didn't react. He simply waited, his hands now resting on the counter. His posture was relaxed, his eyes locked on the leader, waiting for him to make the next move. The tension in the room was palpable, but Keanu's calmness seemed to make it worse for the bikers. They didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't afraid, who wasn't responding the way they expected. Finally, the leader took a step forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. He was furious now, but the anger was mixed with something else, a sense of unease, as though he was beginning to realize that this wasn't a fight he could win. He reached for the chain hanging from his waist, the metal making a faint clink as he pulled it free. "All right, tough guy," the leader said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what you're made of." Keanu's eyes flicked briefly to the chain, then back to the leader. He didn't move, but his body was poised, ready. He didn't need to make a move until the leader made his first. Keanu had always been patient, always waiting for the right moment. In situations like this, that moment always came. The leader swung the chain at Keanu with a wild, reckless motion. It was a sloppy move, the kind of swing you'd make when you were angry and not thinking clearly. But Keanu was ready. In one swift motion, he grabbed the chain mid-air, stopping it dead in its tracks. The force of the swing was still there, but Keanu absorbed it, his grip firm as he pulled the chain away from the leader's hands. The leader stumbled forward, caught off guard by how easily his weapon had been taken from him. He tried to fight back, but it was too late. Keanu was already in motion. With a quick twist of the chain, Keanu sent the leader sprawling to the ground. The sound of the fall echoed in the room, and the remaining bikers took a step back, fear creeping into their eyes. This wasn't a man they could intimidate. Keanu stood over the leader for a moment, his eyes cold, his stance steady. He wasn't trying to hurt the man, he was just making a point. This wasn't about a fight. It was about respect. Keanu knew how to handle himself, and he had made it clear. The leader, now sitting on the floor, looked up at Keanu, his face red with frustration and embarrassment. He had underestimated him. The other bikers, who had been watching this unfold, now looked at each other, unsure of what to do. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a scruffy beard, spoke up. "Maybe it's time we just leave," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This isn't worth it." The leader, still struggling to get up, shot him a venomous glare. But he didn't argue. He was realizing the same thing as the others, this wasn't going to end the way they had imagined. Keanu didn't speak. He simply stepped back and returned to his seat at the bar, his movements calm and controlled, like nothing had happened. The bartender, who had been watching all of this with wide eyes, finally cleared his throat and wiped his hands on his apron. "Do you need anything else?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Keanu shook his head, picking up his drink. "No, I'm good," he said quietly. His tone was polite, almost too calm, as though the chaos around him hadn't even fazed him. The bikers, one by one, began to leave. They didn't make any more noise or threats. They simply filed out of the bar, their heads down, clearly embarrassed by what had just happened. As the last of them left, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room fell into a deep silence. Keanu finished his drink in peace, the sound of the jukebox filling the quiet space once again. The other patrons, who had been watching in stunned silence, slowly returned to their own conversations, though none of them would forget what they had witnessed. Keanu, for his part, didn't seem to notice. He finished his drink, left a tip on the counter, and quietly stood up. The night had returned to normal, but for those who had been there, it was anything but ordinary. The bar had settled into a quiet stillness, the kind of silence that followed a storm. The bikers had finally left, their heavy boots thudding away in the distance. The door had slammed shut behind them with a sense of finality, and the air in the room seemed to relax. The tension that had filled the space just moments before was now gone. Keanu sat back at the bar, his fingers lightly tapping the side of his empty glass. The soft hum of the jukebox in the corner filled the silence, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt different now. The bartender, still in shock from what had just happened, slowly wiped down the counter, his eyes glancing nervously toward Keanu. He had witnessed the whole thing unfold, and now he didn't quite know what to say. There had been a moment, back when the bikers had been surrounding Keanu, when the bartender had thought for sure a fight would break out. But it hadn't. Instead, it had been like watching a calm storm pass by, something that didn't make a lot of noise but left a lasting impression. "You all right?" the bartender asked hesitantly, his voice quiet as he glanced over at Keanu. Keanu, without looking up, nodded. "I'm fine. Just another night." The bartender blinked, unsure if Keanu was joking or being serious. He wasn't sure if there was anyone who could have handled that situation as calmly as Keanu had. He had expected things to get messy, but Keanu had made it look almost effortless. It wasn't the first time Keanu had been in a situation like this, though. The bartender could tell that much. There was something in the way Keanu carried himself, an unspoken confidence, a quiet strength that made him stand out in a crowd. A few moments passed before the bartender spoke again. "Don't get many like you around here," he said, trying to break the silence. Keanu glanced up, meeting his eyes for the first time since the bikers had left. "I guess not." There was an awkward pause. The bartender wasn't sure what else to say. Keanu had been calm and collected the entire time, and he still wasn't giving much away. It was clear that whatever had just happened in the bar wasn't something that fazed him. It was just another night, another town, another group of people who didn't know who they were dealing with. But the bartender wasn't about to push any further. Instead, he just nodded, not wanting to pry into the man's personal life. "Can I get you something else?" the bartender asked after a moment, his voice more relaxed now. Keanu shook his head slightly. "I'm good, thanks." The bartender gave him a small, understanding smile and turned away to finish his cleaning. Keanu, meanwhile, reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. He hadn't been planning on staying long, but the events of the evening had left him in a reflective mood. He began to write something down, his pen moving quickly across the paper. It wasn't much, just a few lines, but it helped him focus, to process the day's events. It was a habit he'd picked up over the years, writing down thoughts when the world felt too loud or chaotic. As he wrote, Keanu's mind wandered. The bikers had underestimated him, and that was something that had happened before. People tended to judge him based on his public image, thinking he was just another actor, someone who could be easily ignored or pushed around. But that was far from the truth. Keanu had spent years studying martial arts, perfecting his combat skills. He wasn't just the character on screen, he was capable of defending himself, and he had learned that in situations like tonight, it was better to remain calm and composed. He wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. He wasn't out to make a name for himself, and he certainly didn't care about impressing anyone. But sometimes, when people pushed too far, it became necessary to remind them that appearances could be deceiving. He wasn't just Keanu Reeves, the actor. He was someone who had the ability to handle himself in tough situations, and that was something people often overlooked. The bartender returned after a few moments, giving Keanu a curious glance as he went about his tasks. Keanu, still lost in his thoughts, didn't seem to notice. His pen kept moving, his eyes focused on the paper in front of him. He wasn't trying to hide, but he wasn't looking for attention either. It was a strange balance, but one he had learned to maintain over the years. In the corner of the bar, a small group of people were quietly talking, their voices low but filled with excitement. They had witnessed everything that had happened between Keanu and the bikers, and now they couldn't stop talking about it. They were still trying to process what they had just seen. It was rare to see someone handle a situation like that with such ease. The way Keanu had dealt with the bikers, calm, controlled, and never once losing his cool, had left them in awe. "I can't believe that just happened," one of them said, his voice filled with disbelief. "That guy was like a machine. He just took them down like it was nothing." Another person chimed in, "I swear, that guy's like John Wick or something. He moved like him, you know. Just like the movies." The others nodded, agreeing with him. "Yeah, I thought the same thing. I mean, who else could take on a group of bikers like that? He didn't even break a sweat." They were speaking in whispers now, but Keanu could hear them. He wasn't offended by it. In fact, it was the kind of conversation he was used to. People had often compared him to his characters, especially John Wick. It wasn't the first time he'd heard someone say it, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But for him, the comparison was just a reminder of how people saw him, not as a person, but as a character. And that was fine. He wasn't bothered by it. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't John Wick. He was Keanu, and that was enough for him. After a few minutes, Keanu finished writing what he needed to, his thoughts now settled. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, finishing his drink. It was time to leave. The night had gone on long enough, and he didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. He stood up from the bar, leaving a tip on the counter. The bartender looked up, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. Keanu nodded back, offering a quiet smile before he turned and walked toward the door. The cool night air greeted him as he stepped outside, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the empty street. The world outside was calm, peaceful. He glanced back at the bar one last time, his eyes briefly resting on the window. The bikers were long gone, and the bar was returning to its usual quiet rhythm. He didn't need to worry about them anymore. He had handled the situation. There was no need to dwell on it. Keanu took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but think about how sometimes, the quietest moments could be the most important. The world might not always see who you really are, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how you carried yourself in silence, in action, and in the moments when no one else was watching. Keanu stepped out into the cool night, the door of the bar swinging shut behind him with a quiet thud. The street before him was empty, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded inside the bar. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. It was refreshing, almost cleansing, after the tension of the evening. For a moment, everything felt calm again. He didn't rush. There was no need to. The night was still young, and the streets were quiet. He walked slowly, letting his mind wander as he made his way down the empty sidewalk. The sounds of his footsteps echoed in the stillness, the only noise in an otherwise silent town. It felt like the whole world was asleep, unaware of the small drama that had just played out in the bar. Keanu had always enjoyed these quiet moments. It was in these moments of solitude that he could truly reflect. He wasn't one for grand gestures or public displays of strength, but every so often, situations like the one inside the bar would remind him of who he really was, not just the actor, but the person who had lived through struggles, learned valuable lessons, and grown stronger because of them. He thought about the bikers. They had come in looking for trouble, not realizing that they had crossed paths with someone who was not easily intimidated. What had started as a small taunt had quickly spiraled into something bigger, but Keanu had handled it with a level of calm that few people could manage. He hadn't needed to fight, hadn't needed to make a spectacle of it. He had simply used his skills and knowledge to defuse the situation. And that was all that was necessary. Keanu's life had been a series of moments like that. He had learned that sometimes, the best way to deal with conflict was to remain calm and collected, to stay focused on the bigger picture. There was no need to rush into action, no need to make a scene. Just handle things quietly and move on. It was a philosophy that had served him well in both his career and his personal life. He didn't let the events of the evening weigh on him. Instead, he focused on the present. The cool breeze, the calm of the night, the feeling of his shoes tapping lightly against the pavement. It was these small things that kept him grounded. These were the moments that helped him stay centered, no matter what was happening around him. As he continued walking, he passed by a small park. It was empty, the benches sitting unused under the dim lights. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly. Keanu slowed down, pausing for a moment to take in the scene. There was something calming about the park at night, the quietness, the solitude. It reminded him of the peace he often sought in his own life. He stood there for a while, just watching the trees sway in the wind, feeling the peacefulness of the moment settle around him. The park was a place of simplicity, a place where time seemed to slow down. It was a small oasis in the middle of the town, a place where people could come to escape the noise of the world. Keanu appreciated that. It wasn't much, but sometimes, the simplest things could bring the most comfort. After a while, Keanu resumed his walk. The town was quiet now, and he was enjoying the solitude. He didn't have anywhere to be, no rush to get back to a hotel or a meeting. He could just walk, letting his thoughts wander freely. His mind drifted back to the bikers. They had come in thinking they could pick on someone who didn't seem like much. They had underestimated him, like so many others did. But in the end, it hadn't been about showing them who was stronger or tougher. It had been about handling the situation with grace, without making a big deal out of it. Keanu wasn't a man who sought confrontation, but he knew how to handle it when it came his way. He didn't care what the bikers thought of him now. He didn't need their approval or respect. What mattered was that he had stayed true to himself, had acted in the way that felt right. It was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was enough for him to know that he had handled the situation with dignity, without resorting to violence or aggression. The further Keanu walked, the more the weight of the day seemed to fade away. He felt lighter now, as if the events of the evening had been washed away by the calm of the night. The streets of the town stretched out before him, empty and peaceful. There were no more bikers, no more confrontations. Just the sound of his footsteps, the soft breeze, and the feeling of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that sometimes, the best way to handle a difficult situation was to let it go. As he walked, Keanu found himself thinking about how things often weren't as complicated as people made them out to be. Life had a way of throwing challenges your way, but it was how you responded that really mattered. You could choose to react with anger, with frustration, or with fear. Or, you could choose to stay calm, to stay centered, and to handle things with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove anything. Keanu wasn't a man who needed to show off or brag about his abilities. He didn't need to tell anyone about what had happened at the bar or what he had done. He simply knew that he had done what was right. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the night wore on, Keanu reached the end of the street. The lights from the town were now far behind him, and the quiet of the countryside surrounded him. He had come to a crossroads in his life, figuratively and literally, but he was at peace with the path he had chosen. There would always be more challenges, more people who underestimated him or tried to push his buttons. But Keanu knew that he didn't need to fight every battle. Sometimes, walking away was the most powerful thing you could do. He looked up at the stars for a moment, taking in the vastness of the night sky. It was a reminder of how small and simple the world could be when you took the time to appreciate it. Keanu smiled to himself, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. The night had been full of surprises, but now it was time to move forward, to keep walking, and to enjoy the quiet peace that only moments like this could bring.